Hello, this is my latest video on my series, The Not So Dismal Science of Economics. And today I want to talk a little bit more about tariffs since tariffs have been in the news. As I mentioned in an earlier session, tariffs are a tax on imports. So the one thing you have to realize is what happens when a tariff is levied. So right now, the proposal by President Trump is to levy a 25% tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico. So the key thing you have to know is, in a sense, first of all, what are for each of the countries the major goods which are exported to the United States. So that's the first step. So in a sense, Canada doesn't export goods from all industries. Most of it is concentrated in a few industries. So I will focus on Canada. So that's the first thing. So the first thing you have to track is which are the industries that currently export to the United States. The second is what would happen if the tariff is imposed? Historically, what tariffs have done is protected domestic producers. Canada, for the longest time, had tariffs against US exports. And in effect, this was the national policy. The national policy at the time was to encourage trade between Eastern Canada and Western Canada, because historically the trade would take place in a north-south direction. So if you think of Alberta or Saskatchewan or Manitoba or BC, the natural sort of trading partner would be the southern or be the northern states. However, the national policy implemented a series of tariffs which made US goods coming into Canada more expensive. Now, what did that do? Well, that allowed manufacturers in the US in Ontario in particular to set up plants. Now, these plants were actually what were called branch plants. So at the time, the US companies who wanted to export to Canada had this option. They could try to sell essentially into Canada by paying the tariff, or they could set up smaller plants to, in a sense, avoid the tariffs. So obviously, tariffs are only applied for goods that are exported into the country. So historically, Southern Ontario had lots of small, what were called branch plants. And so the branch plants allowed the US companies to sell their products within Canada without paying the tariff. Now, part of the problem with that is the plants in Canada were generally designed to serve the Canadian market, which was significantly smaller than the US market. Well, what did that mean? Well, that meant that it was difficult for those plants to achieve economies of scale. By economies of scale, we mean if you produce a larger output, you are able to bring down your costs, in this case, the average cost. So the comparable US goods were always, which were produced and sold in Canada from the branch plants, were always more expensive than the goods which were produced in the US because the US could take advantage of economies of scale. So that's the one thing that tariffs do is tariffs protect domestic firms. So, but when the free trade agreement came in, basically the agreement was to lower tariffs between Canada and the US, and that put a lot of the branch plants in Canada in jeopardy. In other words, they didn't have the protection, as much protection as they did before from US exports. Therefore, a lot of the branch plants closed. So that's the one thing. So tariffs, some sense, people always say tariffs are the mother of trusts. In other words, tariffs allow protection for domestic firms. And if you only have a few domestic firms, then you might not have very much competition within your country. The second thing is when you try to levy the tariffs, the question is what is going to happen to the prices as the tariffs are implemented. So let's just take a look at what Canada currently exports to the US. And so what we have is, just hold on a sec, we have the co-pilot data from what the key Canadian exports to the United States by industry for 2023. So you can see that the total amount is 297.8, so almost 300 billion. But if you look at that, more than half, or almost, say, 2/3 of that, is actually from two industries: mineral fuels, which is oils and other petroleum products, and vehicles. This is from largely from Ontario. So most of the Canadian exports to the US are in two industries. There is some manufacturing or machinery, some plastics, electrical, aluminum, aircraft, but those are in relative terms quite a bit smaller. So that is the big issue that is coming in. And so you have to figure out if the tariff is actually maintained and Trump carries through with the tariff, you have to figure out, okay, what is going to happen to the price of, say, petroleum products or oil? Now, the one problem that Canada has right now is that the US is almost the principal buyer of petroleum products from Canada, which means that in terms of economics, the US is a monopsony, is a sole buyer. So the problem when you're trying to sell to a monopsony is that you don't have outside competition to sell your products to in any substantive sense. So the question is, suppose, just to make things simple, suppose the delivered price was, just for to make the arithmetic simple, suppose it was $100 coming into the US, and there would be a 25% tariff. So, you might think, okay, then what the price for Canadian oil is going to sell for $125 in the US. But be careful here, because the US is the sole buyer, they actually have quite a bit of bargaining power. So the question is what's going to happen to the net price? So right now, if it's delivered to the border at $100, then the 25% is 125. But that's probably not going to happen, because what's going to have to happen is that the US also is thinking of ramping up its own domestic production. Therefore, it's probably not going to be willing to pay 125 for the Canadian oil, which means that the Canadian producers are going to have to what's called eat a substantial amount of the tariff. In other words, it may force Canadian petroleum producers to lower their price much below 100. So therefore, that's the biggest problem that the Canadian oil industry is going to face, is whether they're going to have to reduce their net price in the face of the tariff. So that's the one issue. The second issue is the other industry is autos. And everyone knows that the one industry that the Republicans and Donald Trump as president will want to do is bring back the auto industry. So that is really what he argues. I mean, the point about the border is one thing, and that's more of an issue with the Mexican border. But in general, what Trump's plan is to make it more costly for usually multinational companies to set up plants outside the US and then sell into the US. So really what he wants to do is bring back lots of those manufacturers. And the one way to do that is to make it more costly for those companies to build their products outside the US and sell it into the United States. So that's his strategy. Now, what's interesting is that the question that arises is whether, and this is from economics, we call this a game. This is a game that's being played between the US and Canada and US and Mexico. So the question is, right now, the US has threatened to levy those 25% tariffs. So the question is, now they want US and Canada to take actions. And so the actions that they've suggested are to improve the border or clamp down on the distribution, particularly in Mexico, of drugs coming through. So the question is, what if, and for Canada, it's to increase their military expenditure. So the question is, if they don't do that, does the US have an incentive to still levy those tariffs? Now, to figure out how this game is going to be played, you have to go to the last stage, which is after the decisions are made. Excuse me. So what you have to do is figure out whether it would still be in the interest of the US to levy the tariffs if Mexico and Canada didn't take any actions, or not actions which the US deems significant. And here's where the story is that says, okay, maybe US, and generally when tariffs come in, consumers will pay somewhat higher prices. So the question is, would the Trump administration respond adversely to those higher prices, or would that dissuade them from levying the tariff? If the answer is yes, then Canada and Mexico don't have to worry about the threat. But if the US or the public administration is willing to suffer the economic consequences for that, then that's a credible threat. And so that's really what the negotiators on both sides, both Canada and Mexico, have to try to estimate, is whether Trump is willing to carry out his threats. Now, to find out what someone might do, past practice is usually a useful prior indicator. And what the Trump administration in the past has signaled is that they're certainly willing to levy tariffs, irrespective of any consequences to US consumers. And it's largely because they do have bargaining power. The one thing that a lot of commentators forget is that the US is a large economy. So free trade is not optimal, as I said in an earlier, not necessarily optimal for a large economy that can dictate the terms of trade. So you have to be careful when you're dealing with a large country, thinking that, okay, we're going to retaliate with tariffs. In other words, you're dealing with a big partner, and both Mexico and Canada are relatively small economies in relation to the US. So you have to be careful when you're getting into a tariff trade war with a much larger country. So these are some comments that I thought were relevant to the existing discussion. And the other thing that, I guess the third point that I want to make is that there's a long-term strategy perhaps for the US, is that the US may be willing to suffer a short-term effect on, say, higher consumer prices from the tariff, if that allows them, or if that buys them some future cooperation and leverage on both the Mexican and the Canadian economies. So that's called a repeated game. And, the first period you might suffer losses, but you may be willing to do it if you think you can recoup those losses in future periods. So as I say, if you're a negotiator from the Canadian side or the Mexican side, you've got to be careful in this response. Probably the best strategy for Canada and Mexico is to see whether they can undertake actions which perhaps aren't overly costly, which would mitigate or which would lead the U.S. to moderate its initial tariff policy. So I hope this has been a useful talk. And if you like this video, you can click on like. And if you would like to subscribe to this series, you can press subscribe. So bye for now.